But we're going to start out of the gate with a debunk with our buddy. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He has a great Patreon page that I read regularly, of course. Ben Burgis. Ben, would you like Napoleon the Legend to do a intro song for you?
That would be amazing.
That would actually be pretty amazing.
All right. Duly noted. I'm going to see what's up.
Duly noted. All right. I think that's possible. We also have...
I got to get my lexicon up when I come here, man.
Please not too much. We also have Will EQ, who's also been on the show, who's in Atlanta, who is also like... He's also this incredibly talented lyricist. And it's me talking with both of you to adding to the brilliant DJ Danarchy repertoire. So just letting everybody in on a little background production process here. But that being said, here is the great Moondug. That's who did Ben's song, Matt.
I want to go to mockery really bad.
I will.
Please go.
Okay.
Trying to credit the song called
Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point that's bullshit. Breaking down these right-wing arguments and looking at how they're supposed to fit together.
Okay. Break it down.
Break it down.
Break it down. Break it down.
I like that song better each time. Ben Burgis, welcome.
Thank you.
What are we talking about, Ben?
Well, we're going to be talking about Fareed Zakaria and Bernie Sanders and Nordic social democracy. And of course, Bernie talks a lot about the Nordics, and maybe even too much, right? There's a criticism, that's made tactically that maybe he should spend more time talking about American social democracy, the completing the projects of the New Deal and the Great Society, and I'm sympathetic to that. I think sometimes some leftists hear that and think that's a call for him to maybe tone down the radicalism, but I don't think it needs to be read that way. I think there's actually a way to do it in a way that turns up the dial of radicalism. So something I've been thinking about lately, for example, is that a completely true historical thing that he could point out was that when the Johnson administration initiated Medicare for the elderly, that was supposed to be the first step towards single payer for everybody. Right. The next step was going to be one for kids, and the reason none of that happened is because deepening American involvement in Vietnam made expensive new social spending less plausible, right? So making that point would be a great way to tie together his foreign policy with his domestic proposals, and also show that he's continuing this longstanding tradition with mainstream American roots. But the Nordic stuff, even if it's too emphasized, it is important. Because oftentimes, whenever you propose change in anything, any kind of big reform, people will sort of play dumb about how that could possibly work, or say, this is just craziness. You're suggesting some leap into the unknown. So the more you can say, well, no, in this country, this country, and this country, they've already got all this stuff. It works fine. The better, the better off you are. When I was part of the adjunct professors union at Rutgers, and we were putting, a lot of the things we were pushing for had already happened at the University of Michigan. So it was always fun watching the administration try to explain why the University of Michigan and Rutgers were such totally distinct, and unlike each other entities, that nothing that happened at one could possibly pertain to the other. And you see similar dynamics here. But so first we're going to watch just a short clip of Fareed Zakaria suggesting that Bernie has got it all wrong.
Now, just really quick question. Do we know that Fareed has actually written any of the things that he said? All right, sorry.
We know he at least read it out.
Yeah. Who is he reading in the New Yorker that we have to debunk? All right, go ahead.
I want to talk about Bernie Sanders, who is still, despite South Carolina, the odds-on favorite to win the Democratic nomination. Sanders says that his proposals are not radical at all, pointing again and again to countries in Northern Europe, such as Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, as examples of the kind of economic system he wants to bring to America. But is he right about these countries?
And he goes on in the clip, but we can just look at the Washington Post version, where in his article, it's entitled "Bernie Sanders' Scandinavian Fantasy." He says, if you read the first paragraph there, the image he conjures up is of a warm and fuzzy social democracy in which market economies are kept on a tight leash through regulation, the rich are heavily taxed, and the social safety net is generous. That is, however, an inaccurate and highly misleading description of those Northern European countries today. Take billionaires. Sanders has been clear on the topic. Billionaires should not exist. But Sweden and Norway have more billionaires per capita than the United States. He goes on to talk about the estate tax and other things. But the point that I really want to hit, if we scroll down, all right. So the paragraph starting, in addition, he stressed.
Yeah, you got it.
Countries such as Denmark had to stay extremely open, etc. When look at Northern Europe today, one finds many innovative, high market-friendly policies such as educational vouchers, healthcare deductibles and copays, light regulatory burdens. None of these countries, for example, has a minimum wage. All right, so that sounds like a pretty good case, right? That these places are just very unlike what somebody like Bernie would advocate. So, not going to take this point by point because honestly, he's wrong about so many things that it would eat up the entire post game. I will give a couple of quick examples here. One is the educational vouchers, where he's talking about a program in Sweden that was largely perceived as a disaster. That in fact, other right-wing parties in the region no longer advocate the same thing because of what happened there. And of course, he doesn't make any, he's writing this in a way that suggests that these things exist just all over the place. But like Finland, not only are there no educational vouchers in Finland, there are literally no private schools in Finland. That's not legal there.
Right.
They have the best education system in the world. So a lot of this is covered, like a lot of the just the sort of basic like fact checking of a lot of the sloppy stuff that Zakaria or whoever's writing this.
Could be Zakaria. I'm just asking questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
But like a lot of the sort of basic, a lot of the grunt work in correcting just basic things that get wrong here because Zakaria is lifting it off some, Koch brothers Foundation for the Promotion of Market Values think tank. And if you look at what they say, he didn't even read the whole thing. So a lot of that is covered in an excellent article in Jacobin by Matt Brunig, where he takes, he just takes a lot of this piece by piece and corrects it and talks about why all this is misleading. But I think that just for the sake of what we're doing here with the debunk, focusing on the sort of core bad arguments, want to just take three elements: the thing about billionaires, the thing about the light regulatory burdens, and the thing about the minimum wage, right? So first of all, it's absolutely true that when Bernie Sanders says billionaires shouldn't exist, he is signposting goals that go beyond what's been achieved in the Nordic countries, right? But I don't think he's ever pretended otherwise, right? Like that there's no conflict between saying that, hey, here are a lot of core programmatic things that have been successfully implemented in other countries, so we should do that too, and also having a larger critique of the system and saying that we actually, it'd be better if we went even beyond these places, that like just because Norway or Finland has certain things we advocate, and that's a useful thing to be able to point to because it shows that it's not crazy or utopian or impossible. That doesn't mean that Finland in 2020 represents the endpoint of human history.
Right.
Second point, and both of these last ones, you could read more about in the Brunig piece, but second point about the light regulatory burdens. This makes it sound like Finland, Norway, Sweden, like that maybe like labor laws, environmental laws, like the sort of core things that somebody like Sanders cares about when it comes to regulations are lighter, more business friendly. That you can get away with dumping more crap into the rivers,
Right.
Firing people more easily, et cetera. None of that's true, right? The germ of truth in the claim about light regulatory burdens, if you follow his links and go into his sources, is that because these countries have fairly efficient centralized states, rather than the weird federalist hodgepodge that we have in the U.S., it is actually easier in terms of paperwork and stuff to start a business.
Right.
Right?
Right. The one area we should have less regulation on, they do. Good for them. Great.
Right. It has nothing to do with the kind of regulations that somebody like Bernie Sanders advocates.
And in fact, Bernie Sanders actually helped small businesses significantly when he was mayor of Burlington. And exactly.
Right. Similarly, when it comes to minimum wage, hey, they don't even have a minimum wage. Wow, that must have been some like crazy, like libertarian reform that they did, just deciding to just completely abolish the minimum wage, or maybe not, right? As it turns out, not. The actually business interests in some of these countries advocate for a minimum wage, and because the labor unions are so strong, the unions reject that as a maneuver to that, like, oh, if we had this government minimum, they would justify being able to pay people just that, right? What we should continue is our tradition of sectoral bargaining, whereby these incredibly powerful labor unions negotiate sector by sector wages for entire parts of the economy. And actually, the spread between the lowest and highest paid workers is much more egalitarian because of that. And the worst paid workers are paid much more than they are here.
So first part, non sequitur. Next two parts, insanely just sort of comically misleading and mendacious. Before you go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, though, I think it would really, just because this is actually pretty funny, there's one more thing that's worth highlighting here.
Yes.
So we have this screenshot of the graph of this because this is amazing. Zakaria claims in the article that it's evidence. He says, okay, granted, there was a time when Sweden was implementing this very Bernie Sanders-like program. They were really on the socialist road, but it was an economic disaster. And here, and this time, this was in the 70s and 80s. And here's the evidence he brings up. That from 1970 to 1995, they added net zero jobs to the Swedish economy. Well, let's look at the graph from the screenshot. Do we have that?
Yes.
All right. So if you look at it, important extra information to know. The Socialist Party was in power from about 1970 to about 1990.
That's beautiful. Explain it for people who are listening. That's you should watch this though. That's a graph even I could understand.
This is so from 1970 to 1990, when the left was in power in Sweden, employment went way up steadily. And then from 91 to 95, when the right was in power, it went down to about where it started. Hence, from 1970 to 1995, they added net zero jobs to the Swedish economy.
It's amazing. Did you ever, Napoleon, did you ever have a period of time, and I'll admit I did, I'll embarrass myself, where maybe you were signaling to people that if you had a Fareed Zakaria book or you pretended to muscle your way through that show, that was, you were a man of the world?
I believe not.
Did you ever have it? You never watched him or read him?
Oh, Fareed Zakaria?
Yeah.
The guy, I mean, I know who he is, but I've never dug into anything.
Yeah.
He was never a reference for me. No. I just thought he was
Lucky.
like, what's that called? Affirmative action at CNN at the time or something like that, man. Because I didn't know what he brought to the table.
Yeah. He's one of these figures that it's amazing. Like him and Thomas Friedman and people like that still have so much power, but it is amazing to watch them. They're propping a world that exists because they represent capital, of course. But the ideological project they're propping is done. I mean, I remember he wrote this book called The Post-American World about the rise of India and China, which I read in 2007 probably because I was doing my thesis on that stuff. And among many other things, I remember him kind of saying that, like, this is the pre-crash, that one of the reasons that America would be able to kind of maneuver this was for all the problems in America, some of which sounded kind of borderline like, including democracy, was, America had a super innovative financial system. Wow. So, that was going to help us out. The fact that people were buying collateral debt.
It really seems like the function ideologically, somebody like Fareed Zakaria is like, I don't know, you listen to somebody on a college campus say something, about American imperialism, and somebody else gets defensive and patriotic, and then you get to be the smart, sophisticated, worldly guy and lean in and say, actually, China and India, that's really where it's at, coming up. And there's this guy Modi I read Fareed Zakaria talk about. Very interesting guy.
I think you just nailed. That's literally what he's there for. Ben Burgis, give them an argument. Logic for the left. Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.